What is astroturf activism? Well, I'm sure there's a formal definition for it. My definition is as follows. It's a fake movement that is often well-funded and financed by a group or organization in order to promote a cause. A prime example of this from my life is the $15 an hour movement in Seattle. Back when I was a Bernie bro, I was a part of this movement, a very vocal part. Yep, I was an indoctrinated idiot. But even though I live my life by the philosophy of trust but verify, I was completely duped by this AstroTurf campaign until they had their first convention. You see, everyone, the media, neighbors, everybody, thought that the native and residential Seattleites were the primary promoters of the movement to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. There were hordes of promoters going door to door advocating it. They were on the street corners. They were everywhere. But shortly after it passed, I got to know some of these people. And what I discovered was that this mass group of people promoting the $15 an hour movement for Seattle, very few, except the leadership, were from Seattle. Almost none of them were residents. Thus, next to none of them were actual Seattle voters. They were flown in from all over the country and the world. These were communists from every continent except for Antarctica, and they came in droves. They lived in Seattle for 6 to 9 months during the campaign, and they were very successful. There were many hundreds of them. Once I discovered these people were not Seattleites, some obvious questions rose to mind. Who paid for their visas, their flights, their room and board, the cars they were driving? The propaganda material they handed out and used to promote this cause, and most importantly, who paid their wages? Because these people seemed to have an unlimited amount of spending cash. And what I quickly discovered is that this was a multi-million-dollar AstroTurf campaign by well-funded, well-connected communists from around the world. And trust me, they were very open about their communist beliefs. It was at this point, at the end of the $15 an hour event, an event which I actually spoke at, that began my move away from the left and progressive politics. Because as much as I wanted to deny it, the $15 an hour movement, and shortly thereafter I discovered many other progressive causes, they were built on lies, half-truths, and statements taken disingenuously out of context. I couldn't stand with a political movement that not only lied to the general public, but also lied to its own followers. Obviously, I was deeply offended because I was manipulated into becoming their useful idiot, their cat's paw, in order to promote their communist lie. Now, why did I share this story? It's really simple to not only show men that everyone can be successfully lied to, especially those who consider themselves critical thinkers, but also to warn men about a new AstroTurf campaign that seeks to demoralize self-reliant masculine men as a group and individually, and destroy their lives by manipulating them into becoming failed criminals. And they're actively and knowingly doing this in order to use men as useful idiots to promote their many false narratives about masculinity. Now, what am I talking about? Well, everyone with 2 brain cells to rub together understands that traps are homosexual members of the LGBT community. But there's a lesser-known trap that most people, especially men, don't realize that has been flourishing across the manosphere and in conservative circles for the last few years. And that's the honey trap. Now, when most people think about honey traps, they think of men employed by the government being manipulated into sexual encounters with sexy women who are part of a spy networks hostile to that man's government. While this is often the case, it isn't the entire story. These encounters aren't always heterosexual in nature, but all are linked to the emotional and psychological manipulation of these men. And when that doesn't work, they resort to blackmail. However, not all honey traps are sexual in nature either. Some take the form of social or financial favors or conduct directed toward the target in order to place them into a compromising position. Again, in preparation for either manipulation or blackmail. In some cases, the people running the honey trap go so far as to use cult-like conditioning, isolation, manipulating confirmation bias, and other common brainwashing techniques in an effort to achieve their goals. To that end, what I'm referring to are groups, movements, and those who've already infiltrated self-reliant men's communities who are actually attempting to subvert and manipulating them in order to later falsely paint them individually and as a community as villains and enemies of the state. A recent example that next to no one has discussed is the social media platform Parler. When it first came out, I was skeptical, and said as much on my Twitter, Gab, and Mind social media accounts. The reason I was concerned was because initially they were banning accounts for the use of offensive language, such as general curse words like the F-bomb. Then later it turned out they were banning people who expressed America First and Make America Great Again leanings, which I gotta say, as an American, Why wouldn't I think that American values shouldn't be first? The Japanese, Chinese, Russians, and Australians all think their governments should place their people first. This is not racist. It's only natural to the indigenous citizens of these countries to promote that country's values. But, I digress. Then, after the January 6th protests that were not only attended by Antifa and BLM protesters in disguise, and this was not only later confirmed by the mainstream media, but I addressed it in a recent video, but also undercover government agitators attended. Well, after that protest ended and Parler was attacked for allowing Americans who supported the protests to speak their minds on their platform, Parler removed their CEO from his position and then publicly admitted that they proactively and without a warrant or request contacted the FBI and provided them with information on law-abiding patriotic Americans who voiced support for the January 6th protest. Nearly all these people Parler turned over to the FBI were law-abiding citizens who had committed no crime. They didn't even voice a desire to commit any crime, let alone initiate an insurrection, which was widely and falsely reported by nearly all legacy media outlets. Let's be clear, this demonstrates that Parler is being used to funnel American patriots to their platform and then, without their knowledge or consent, turning their private information over to the government so that these law-abiding citizens can be falsely villainized and witch-hunted as extremists and domestic terrorists. But it doesn't stop there. If you remember, a few months ago, the FBI uncovered a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan by men who were self-described members of the Boogaloo movement. What a lot of people don't know about the FBI Astroturf Boogaloo Boys group is that they appeared overnight, and there was a mass campaign on counterculture social media and mainstream platforms promoting them. Whoever created this PSYOP spent a lot of time and money promoting it. It definitely wasn't an organic grassroots campaign. And clearly, it's also another valid example of a honeypot. To that end, once these conspirators were outed, arrested, and criminally charged for conspiring to kidnap the governor, it was discovered that the member with the most ideological and psychological influence with the group, the guy who may not have been the stated leader, but was definitely pulling the group's strings, was also an FBI informant. It's also important to note that this group committed no actual crimes. They just talked about committing crimes. And just as importantly, it was the FBI informant initiating, promoting, and keeping these conversations alive. Now, no discussion about AstroTurf honeypots can be complete without discussing the Proud Boys, a group that portrays itself as the tip of the spear in the arena of the America First activism movement. It turns out at least two prominent leaders of this group were also FBI informants with a long relationship with the FBI. While these examples and many others like them are important to know and understand, by themselves they don't tell the full story, which is that self-reliant men are being targeted by the government for misandrous demoralization and discrimination by communists and their followers. You see, prominent members of the FBI and the CIA were also formerly openly members of the Communist Party. While they may not have been voting members, they were openly members and both today still speak out against America First, the United States Constitution, and making America great again. Make no mistakes, the lives of self-reliant, self-made men and their success stories verifiably disprove the communist narrative that everyone should be financially and ideologically dependent upon a socialist welfare state. Today, the manosphere is being targeted. It's being demonized by communist front nonprofit groups like the ADL, as well as their ideological allies, their comrades in arms, so to speak. The ones who are pushing for the Great Reset that will be the death to America as a constitutional republic. To make matters worse, these enemies of self-reliant men have publicly admitted they're closely partnered with the FBI to target the manosphere generally and the MGTOW community specifically. And you know who are the FBI's low-hanging fruit within the manosphere and the MGTOW communities? It's the men and boys who voluntarily self-isolate themselves from their families and local communities. The men who live alone, but yearn for companionship, whether it's through the bonds of close family relationships, close and valid friendships, or intimate relationships with women and wannabe women. It's the men who are diagnosed and being treated for mental health issues caused by being raised in a single-parent household, which by definition are dysfunctional. The ones who sit at the computer all day and ignore the world around them, including their family and potential friends. But to make matters even worse than that, there's now mentally unstable yet persuasive voices within the manosphere who are speaking out in favor of ideological no-go zones, incel enclaves, and in some cases, a gender war motivated by a desire to enslave women so that they can touch a real vagina. I hate to break it to these men, but psychological instability that inspires enslaving women to become sex slaves and the concept of self-actualization are mutually exclusive. Put another way, myopically focusing on forcing women to have sex and living free from sexual validation from women are also mutually exclusive ideologies. This is why when I see a news story of a man who's killed or assaulted his wife, ex-wife, or girlfriend, or her other boyfriend, I nearly always remark that if that man had went MGTOW, doing that alone could have avoided the violence I'm now reading about. Just as importantly, every time a man does something like this or becomes a mentally unstable mass shooter, he's labeled as an incel, member of the manosphere, or MGTOW, and then these communities are demonized, which reinforces an important point. Committing violence, especially mass violence, does nothing to help men, and it clearly doesn't put the perpetrator in a superior position in life, which, let's be clear, normally ends in either suicide or suicide by cop. This leads me to another point. None of these issues or incidents exist in a vacuum, and communists do a fantastic job of spinning everything to their benefit, including everything I've discussed up to this point. Today, there's a YouTube MGTOW channel called MGTOW is for Losers. The hashtag associated with it is MGTOW for Prison. Prominently displayed in its off-pink banner is the registered logo and trademark of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, a group closely associated with the FBI. The ADL operative who runs the channel is an ambiguously masculine white knight that goes by the name of Jeff. While this channel doesn't have much traction yet, it's devoted to the demoralization, bullying, and harassment of the MGTOW community. And because it doesn't have any of the copyright strikes for the ADL registered trademark, one can reasonably conclude that it's sponsored, as a whole or in part, as a campaign of the ADL, which in the past has spoken openly in opposition of the MGTOW community and the self-reliant men within it. And finally, something everyone should be aware of. Prominent feminist Laura Bates wrote an anti-male book that was recently published. In speaking about it, she admitted that she and others went undercover and infiltrated the MGTOW community for a year without being discovered. Specifically, she states that she got close to the fans of the communities surrounding Turd Flinging Monkey and Sandman. Years ago, I spoke out against this sort of entryism, loudly and without apology. And then, people thought I was being hyperbolic and overreacting. It turns out, I was right on point. And as a result of the majority of the manosphere and MGTOW communities ignoring my warnings, some even outright attacking me and falsely accusing me of a variety of things, today, these communities are directly in the crosshairs of communist NGOs and federal law enforcement agencies for the very things I've discussed throughout this video and warned about years ago. The takeaway? Avoid those who talk about no-go zones, incel enclaves, gender war, and the things that could inspire those around them to commit violence. It's clear that not only are these people mentally unstable, but they could also be FBI informants. And if you're a MGTOW content creator with a community or a Discord channel that includes these people, I encourage you to purge it now, before an FBI SWAT team uses it as a false pretense to raid your home and while there looks for any reason or excuse they can to kill you. In other words, practice the martial art of not being there, and when you see signs of this sort of honey trap, move quickly toward the door and ghost your own way. I'm DDJ, and this warning against being a cat's paw of the false feminist and communist hate machine is your dose of misandry today.